Let's turn to Acts chapter 10, or turn to the summary version of it. This is just a real quickie, just to remind you of what we covered. I found that as I study Acts chapter 10, that if you look at it from the perspective of Peter's interaction with Cornelius and his family, and if you carefully get the context of the chapter itself, you're going to find that it's really not a vision where Peter sees the sheet with all the animals. It's not really a vision telling Peter to avoid keeping kosher anymore, to abandon keeping kosher. I've heard that commentary, I've heard that interpretation. I disagree with it. I don't think it's the strongest interpretation of the passage. What did I find? Let's read. In section 6 of this commentary to Galatians, we conducted another test case using Peter and the account in Acts chapter 10. I say test case because I've got this hypothesis that a lot of what you're going to find in the New Testament is this idea of covenantal nomism as seen through the lens of works of the law, Jewish identity for the sake of covenant membership, and Torah keeping for the sake of maintenance of covenant membership. That's my hypothesis. That's my thesis. What we found as we studied Acts chapter 10 is that the Jewish nationalism that was present in Paul's Galatians was also very much alive and well in Peter's book of Acts experience with Cornelius. To be sure, Peter himself needed to be taught a very valuable lesson on Gentile equality in Messiah, and I believe that that's the reason HaShem sent the vision in the first place. So what I found is that if the rabbinic literature that survived the destruction of the Second Temple is any indication of the pattern of religious life in first century Israel, then the Judaism of Peter's day, held to the common belief that Jewish Israel held an exclusive place among the righteous peoples of the earth. They had basically, as I describe it, they'd hijacked righteousness, they'd hijacked an audience with God. Possession of the Torah was basically a trophy in their hands, and it was wielded in such a way as to restrict membership into the people group unless you went through the proselyte conversion process. Let's keep reading. The poison, I call it poison, the poison of ethnocentric Jewish exclusivism that permeated the first century Jewish society had erected a wall of separation between your average Jew and your average Gentile. Go back and read Ephesians 2:14 with this in mind, where Paul talks about the wall of separation. I think that's part of what's going on in Peter's experience with Acts chapter 10. And because of this social view, the view that was really maintained in the first century, because of this, your average Gentile, because of this, many religious Jews sought to keep a measured distance away from most Gentiles. Basically, they believed the average Gentile to be intrinsically unclean or defiled. We talked about those two Greek words, koinos and akathartos. We talked about how that koinos is, koinos is essentially this idea of this man-made declaration of unfit for use, just based on maybe contact with other peoples, or something to the idea that man looks at something that God declared as clean, for instance, like beef or lamb, and because it came into contact with that which was common, like Gentile contact, or maybe contact with idols, then a religious Jew might declare that item food as koinos. And then akathartos was this idea that God declared it off limits, like what he might say in Leviticus chapter 11, Deuteronomy chapter 14, foods that were declared unclean from a biblical perspective. And we talked about these two ideas, and we didn't really flesh them out. Perhaps if you're interested in that, maybe we can go back through that someday, or we can do a study on Acts chapter 10 along with me, if you'd like to look at those two words a little bit more closely. But your average religious Jew kept a distance from your average Gentile, because the Jews were seeking to keep clean, to stay clean, and they didn't want to defile themselves lest they be restricted from access to the temple. And the Gentiles were essentially capable of transmitting ritual impurity to the Jews. At least that was their perspective. or at the very least, Gentiles were often thought to lead Jews away into idolatry. That was another reason why religious Jews often, not always, not exclusively, avoided Gentile contact. They didn't want to be led away into idolatry, lest they be cut off, suffer the penalty of karet. So,